Okay, so this is the assurance for all the cholim of Klal Yisrael. May they have a speedy refuah shlema.
Amen.
Okay, so it's tefillin,
Right.
and the thing with tefillin is, and I'll just read what it says here. So it's just a short one, and I'll give you a personal anecdote here. The Gemara in Brachas 14b says, if one recites the Shema without tefillin, it is considered as if he testifies falsely against himself. This is because during the Shema he recites the words "Ukshartem lot al yadecha," which means you shall tie them on your hand as a sign, and he does not do so. Therefore, one should always see to it to don tefillin before reciting the Shema. However, this is true only where he will not miss Sof Zman Kriyat Shema. If he doesn't have tefillin available and by waiting for repair, the time of Shema will pass, he should daven and recite Shema even without tefillin. At a later point, when the tefillin becomes available, he should don them and recite the parashiot of the Shema again, that is the 3 verses. Therefore, a traveler should make sure that his tefillin are available for davening. Okay, so, and I think I even asked a Rov about this, because as you know, I used to run road races in South Africa, and we used to try daven before, and sometimes I didn't have my tefillin with me, and I still davened. Then, after the race, I went back and put tefillin on and said the Shema. And the same applies. Let's say you're running late for a minyan. I mean, it doesn't really apply during the week for any of us. We're not going to start davening at 10 o'clock in the morning. But if that may have been the case, and then you need to say the Shema by the designated time, otherwise you miss the mitzvah. So, and that's what I was told. So ideally you should say it with the tefillin on, but if you don't, you need to say it again with the tefillin on.
Okay.
Even after the time of Kriyat Shema, because the tefillin have the Shema in the Shel Rosh and Shel Yad.
Okay, thank you. I want to dedicate your halachic teaching, as well as the Gemara share, for the refuah of Yitzhak Yehuda ben Miriam. I'll tell you the story. My nephew went to Cape Town, and he went with some other guys. My young nephew, he's 16. And their contemporaries all went to Cape Town, and one of the kids got hit by a wave and got knocked unconscious and landed up in ICU with a spinal op. He still can't use his feet, and we're davening that he's not going to end up being a paraplegic.
Yeah, I know the family. Yeah, the other night I asked, that was the I think I had the full name, but
yeah,
it's Gabriel Moritz's son. Yes.
Yeah. That's correct. So it's Gabriel
and Marissa from from Kome, from Kalula. Yeah.
So
yes, no, absolutely. And
my nephew was on holiday with him. They were together in the same apartment.
Yeah, and my mom and Marissa, who Gabriel is the mother, my mom and her late mom were best mates from primary school days. So yeah, no, sure. So it's Yitzhak Yehuda ben Miriam.
Yeah, so that was
Yitzhak.
Rang a bell because you wanted the share for that refuah. So please God,
yeah, thank you. So it's Yitzhak Yehuda or Yehuda Yitzhak?
I'll tell you now, sorry. It's Yitzhak Yehuda ben Miriam.
Yitzhak Yehuda ben Miriam, yes. Yeah.
So
that's very sad, Damon.
No, right. Please God, we can dive under, we can learn, and please God, he makes a full recovery. One has to be very careful in the mission, very careful. And on Shabbos, just one thing before I start teaching, the beach that I'm at, Toti, there was an article that 15 people were washed and emergency services had to go there with those jet ski or those emergency things to go and rescue 15 people. I would have been there. And those were just normal bathers that went in by a meter or half a meter that had to be rescued. There was a special swell that took everybody out. And I usually swim quite far out. I never would have been able to get back. And it was on Shabbos it happened.
Jeez.
So thank God I wasn't in the water, because the time that it happened, I would have been in the water. and I would have been farther than anybody because those were people sucked in that were only a half a meter in. I'll send you the guys the article. So Hashem made miracles to keep Shabbos. So,
yeah, 100%.
Yeah, so let's start
Definitely
the
helps.
teaching.
Yeah, I was once swept, eh? Sorry, can I just say something for another
Sure.
10, 20
Sure.
seconds?
Sure.
Many years ago, I was at camp in Margate, and I was swept past the shark nets. I had to get rescued by a lifesaver. I woke up on the beach.
Yes,
And
sir.
the lifesaver, when I was a reservist, the wife of the guy leading the course told me she was the lifesaver that saved me. I woke up on the beach. Yeah, that's it. You don't realize it.
No, you
She
don't.
came to save me. Yeah,
And in fact, funny enough, my grandfather, who was a bodybuilder, very strong, got into trouble in Durban, and he was rescued by my mom's mum, my gran, and she was an excellent swimmer, but he was a big bodybuilder, and he lost stamina in the water, and she was superb.
Jeez.
So she saved her husband's life. So I'm saying the water, even if you're naturally fit, the minute you can't stand, it's a problem. So Kev, thank God you're with us today. Please God, I hope you make a full recovery.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Let's begin.
Amen. Yeah.
Amen. So the Gemara.
Yeah, thank God you all here today. You all had issues.
We are on the 60th daf. So guys, that's a good achievement. So the Gemara quotes further from the Mishnah: if the wind fanned the fire, all are exempt. So the Mishnah teaches that if a person fanned the fire into a blaze, he's liable. But if it was the wind that did so, all of the people who previously contributed to the fire are exempt from liability. The obvious logic is because without the wind, nothing would have come to fruition. The fire wouldn't have taken traction. So the Gemara discusses a case where a person and a wind fanned a fire at the same time. So they're saying, what if it was just a person and the wind, and they both needed each other? So the rabbis taught in the Brisa, if a person fanned the fire and the wind fanned it at the same time, the law is as follows. If there was a sufficient force in the person's fanning to have set the fire ablaze, he's liable. Okay. And it means that the fire would have become a damaging blaze through the person's actions alone without the wind. The entire brisa then refers to a wind that wouldn't have sufficed on its own to make the fire flare up. Because if the wind had been of such a strength, the person wouldn't be liable because the person on his own would not have been needed in order to take the fire to the next level, regardless of how he blew. Because the blaze would have developed without him. That's according to the Tosfot and Rush. In other words, it makes no difference here whether the wind was of usual or unusual strength. The reason why one usually is not liable for damage caused by an abnormal wind, and this is something to really bear in mind, is that you don't expect it. And the reason is irrelevant in this case because the wind already began to blow and the person was aware of its strength. But according to Tosfot, if the person himself didn't have enough stamina on his own to create the fire without the wind, it wouldn't have come to anything either way. So if there was sufficient force in the person's fanning to set the fire ablaze, he's liable. But if not, he's not liable. And what that means is, in this case, neither the person by himself nor the wind by itself could have succeeded in generating the blaze. In other words, it was the combination of their forces that achieved the result. So you're not liable for damage done by your fire unless you made it into a damaging blaze entirely by yourself. And at that point, when you made it into a damaging blaze, you then have to make sure that you see that the wind doesn't take it, even a normal wind, to the next level. But if you needed the wind in order to create it, that abdicates your responsibility as needing a co-force in order to have gotten the blaze to function. And if you were one of the factors, but not the factor that could have done without the external factor, it doesn't suffice. So you would say then maybe why aren't you responsible for being a factor? Because if I say to you, I'm supplying the bullets, but you supplying the gun, the bullets on their own will do nothing. The gun on their own will do nothing. So if you remember, Gavin, in Sanhedrin, we learned this case of where one person is beaten with 9 clubs. Remember that? And since we don't know who did the final death blow, the sages say that none of them were. You can't make anyone specifically liable. My question with Ian was, well, why don't they all become liable since they contributed? And that is the opinion. I think it was Rabbi Yochanan. But I think the rest of the sages say that unless you can attribute it to one death blow, it's difficult to make everybody culpable because you don't know who did it. So we're dealing with a similar sort of concept. So just to summarize, when each one of the two forces, in other words, the person's fanning and the wind, could have sufficed by itself to create the blaze, the person isn't liable. But the person fanning by itself could have created the blaze, and the wind by itself could not, the person is liable. Where neither force on its own could have created the blaze, except together with the other one, the person is not liable. So the Gemara says, well, I'm not sure about that last case, that if together they work together, that there'd be no liability, because there is a question. I don't know if any of you guys did Chazorah. Did any of you guys do preparation for this? Yeah?
Yeah, not this weekend, but I was ahead because last week we hardly did anything. So I covered it the previous week. I'll try to remember, but I have covered this.
Okay, that's fine. Is Arthur with us? He doesn't have to be attending as long as good. I'm happy with the hand up. All right, perfect. So what we're saying is here, there's a question, right? Now, how do we know this? There's this question of winnowing on the Sabbath. Now, I didn't know what winnowing was in English, to be honest. And I'll explain to you what it is. I had to look it up. So it says, let it be like the one who winnows on the Sabbath, and wind assists him by blowing away the chaff. One who winnows on the Sabbath is liable for desecrating the Sabbath, even though his actions were assisted by the wind. Okay, so let me just tell you what winnowing actually is, because I didn't know. Well, I don't know because I'm not a farmer. So apparently this winnowing process is when you toss grain in the air, and then the wind carries away the chaff. So you've got the wheat and you've got the chaff, or you've got the milli kernels, and you've got the, what do you call it, the outer, lighter material. And the heavier kernels fall back down to the ground, and the lighter material, which you don't eat, basically blows away with. So although he doesn't separate the chaff from the kernels with his own hands, and he uses the wind to accomplish his goal, winnowing is a forbidden labor act on the Shabbos. It's a malacha. Okay? So you can see from here that one who harnesses external forces in the execution of a task is considered as though he did the task by himself. Otherwise, we wouldn't make him culpable for breaking Shabbos. So he's saying, here's a case where on the Sabbath we use a wind to create a purposeful activity of winnowing, separating the good from the bad, the wood from the chaff. And in that case, it's prohibited on the Shabbos, even though you harnessed a wind as a partner in the creation. So what we're saying is, why don't we apply the same principle here and render the person who fanned the fire liable, despite the fact that he acted in concert with wind? So that's a question from Tosfot and Rabbah. Okay? So the Gemara has to have an answer for it, because it's saying...
Can you just repeat that question, Damon? Sorry. I didn't hear you clearly. Sorry.
No
just
problem.
the question, that's it.
So what it's saying is here is it's saying, listen, something doesn't make sense. Is when you're talking about the fact that if you have a partnership with an external force, there's no liability. So if I'm making a fire, Gavin, and I'm saying I need myself and the wind as equal partners, because without both of us, the fire wouldn't have actually grown to a point of destruction. We're not talking about when I create a fire and the wind takes it over. There I'm responsible because the fire was initiated by me. We learned that it was stated, the one who ignites the place. That was already stated in the Chumash. But if you need an external force, like a cat in Arthur's video, to start something catastrophic, as Kevin would say, then in that case, it's like supplying somebody a gun without bullets or bullets without a gun. Without both factors.
It's a catalyst. It's a
catalyst, exactly. The wind was the catalyst for a successful fire. Well done, Arthur. So the thing of it is, Gavin, the question is, if you're off the hook because you've got almost another contributing factor and you alone couldn't have started the fire, you're not liable. So the question arises, why are you liable for breaking Shabbos? Because in the process of winnowing, what happens is I'm taking mealies and chaff around or wheat from the chaff, and I'm throwing it in the air. And then what happens is the heavier part, which we use for actually for dough, flour that's ground up, is the process of what falls on the ground. And what blows away is what we wouldn't use anyway. So that's forbidden on Shabbos. And what the Gemara is saying is that you need that as a partnership of you working with the wind in order to willow chaff. Does that make sense? So in other words, in that case, you're held liable if you've got the wind as a partner. But why in this case are you not held liable?
Well, because it's not Shabbos. The other one's Shabbos. On Shabbos, the moment because the fact that you're throwing it up into the wind, you know what is going to happen. You know it's going to create malacha. So you just can't do it. It's Shabbos. The other one's not Shabbos. So it's, to me, I look at it a bit differently.
Okay.
Am I right in it?
So I think you've got 2 points which we're going to hit upon that I just wanted to say for well done, because for example, Rabbi Ashi would agree with you. You're in good standing with Rav Ashi, but not with the 3 other opinions. But Rav Ashi is a very strong opinion. If you can turn around and say, Rav Ashi agrees with my opinion, believe me, that's a heavyweight. So there's certainly no problem with that. The other issue is that Gavin brought up, which is a valid point, is that you actually know what the wind's going to do in that case. What happens is when you create a fire, I don't know if you guys are experts at creating fire. If you gave me Blitz fire lighters and match and paraffin, I wouldn't be able to start a fire. I was pretty useless at starting fires. In other words, I don't know how much wind it takes to fan a fire. I'm no expert. And what Gavin's saying is it's different with winnowing. This is what I think he's saying, because there, it's not rocket science. You throw it in the air, the heavier stuff comes down, the lighter stuff blows away, and there you are. You know the formula. You know you're going to have a productive outcome. And one of the things that are prohibited on Shabbos is having a purposeful outcome. In other words, Gavin, interestingly enough, you've got a good point, because if you, for example, separating wheat from chaff, or let's call it the throwaway from the usable part of the kernels, okay? That's a purposeful act. That's prohibited on Shabbos. Now, for example, there's a question that if you just write letters, is it derisive, prohibited, or rabbinic? It's rabbinic. Because if you're writing a sentence that makes sense, you're writing a letter, Kevin, that makes sense. You've heard it. That makes sense. That's derisive, prohibited. But as far as I know, there's no productive benefit. Rabbis came to prohibit it just to create a fence around it. But if you're writing gibberish, A, C, F, G, etc., and you're just writing letters for the sake of writing letters, and you've got no rhyme or reason for it, it's not derisive, prohibited, because you're not doing anything purposeful. You're not actually constructing anything. And why does it have to be purposeful, Arthur, since you did Chazorah? You don't know. That's okay. The reason.
By the way, James, about the sense. Sorry, Karen.
Yeah, about them.
You said when you write something and it makes sense, it's supposed to be if you write something and you make a sentence.
Sentence. Yeah. Like when they give somebody the death sentence for breaking Shabbos, exactly. It has a sentence for a sentence.
Exactly.
Okay. So,
Yes.
This is going full circle. This.
So you're saying
sentence. I just want to finish mine. One sec. Is that what happens is the 39 melachos, the 39 activities that were involved in the construction of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. It was construction work. It was purposeful. It had a positive outcome. If you destroying something, then it's not prohibited. Darius is prohibited rabbinically. So you might say to me, "What about reaping? That sounds destructive." It's not, because why the heck do you think you grow wheat if not to make bread from the flour? That's the whole point. You're growing it. So in other words, when you're harvesting, it's destroying the field, but it's in order to have the purpose of why you grew the wheat to start with. But if you're just burning a field or whatever the case may be for no constructive purpose, it's only prohibited or rabbinic. So that brings up Gavin's 2 points. I don't know if I'm making sense to you guys. Do any of you guys have a question at this point?
Yeah.
Yeah, talk to me.
Is it bringing this up because you're comparing with somebody who used the wind to aid the expansion, the spreading of the flame, to winnowing, to separating the as constructive in creating the fire? Is that why it's brought it up?
Exactly. So what the question is, in one sentence, it's this simple. If I say to you that if you create a fire in conjunction with the wind, okay, and in other words, the fire wouldn't have actually, it basically would have burnt out without the wind as your partner. And therefore, if the fire then damaged something, it's saying you're not responsible for the simple reason is you on your own couldn't have created the fire without this external force. So if you're not responsible because you had a partner as the wind, why are you responsible for breaking Shabbos if you're performing a malacha with the wind as your partner? And Gavin brought up 2 points. And one of those points is Rabbi Zari, is because Shabbos are the different rules that apply. And it's not necessarily a case where you apply the same rules. That's what Rabbi Zari says. But it doesn't mean that it's the rule here. But the other 3 opinions are saying different, is that it's a logical objection, Gavin, that if you prohibited from having a partner in that case and you held liable, why aren't you held liable in this case? Okay. The second point was very simple, is that there, in the case of winnowing, you know what you're doing. You're throwing it in order for the part you don't use to be blown away, the lighter part, and the part that you will use to fall on the ground, and you know the formula. Creating a fire, you don't know if the wind's going to make it work, not make it work, how much wind you need, how much, unless you're an expert. If you're like me, you don't know what you're doing, but maybe there are people that know what they're doing. So I thought you had 2 points there, but Gavin, maybe I misinterpreted what you're saying.
No, that's basically what I said.
What?
You just said it a little bit more. That's basically what I said, yeah.
Okay.
But
So
you just said it a little bit more eloquent. You just said it a little bit more eloquently than me. But that was the essence of what I was saying.
Okay, so let's see what some of the answers are. So Abaya said, what case are we dealing with here? Where he fanned a fire from one side and the wind fanned it from another side. So he's saying, look, if the wind's going in a northern direction, from south to north, and you blowing from north to south, what you're doing is you actually being counterproductive. So if you created the entire fire and you're that strong to go against the wind, it's very unlikely. And in fact, the person's actions didn't help it at all. In other words, because you're being counterproductive to the wind. That's according to Rashi. In a case where the wind and the person are blowing in opposite directions, in that case, if we're talking about this case here, there's no liability because you didn't fan the fire. So in other words, if the person and the wind blow from opposite directions, only one of them was actually liable for fanning the fire into a blaze. That's according to Tolstoy. So given that the person's efforts were insufficient on their own to create the blaze, you've got to conclude that the wind accomplished it entirely by itself, despite the fact that the wind didn't appear to be so strong. Okay, so it would emerge that the person's actions didn't contribute anything to the blaze, and he's not responsible for it. However, the fanning would have contributed something, although it produced the blaze only with the wind's assistance, you'd be liable. So in other words, Abai is saying if they're both blowing in the same direction, well, it's like winnowing. They're partners, and therefore you're liable. We talk about here where the person is creating a force counterproductive to the wind. So obviously they're not partners in that. That's the bottom line. Rava is saying something else. The Brisa says that it refers to a case where he was fanning the fire together with the normal wind, but the wind then changed, and it fanned it with the force of an abnormal wind. So what it means is that when the person began fanning the wind, he wasn't blowing, the wind wasn't blowing strongly, it's a normal wind. So he knew under such circumstances his efforts would not succeed. Then suddenly the wind changed with unusual intensity, and then the fire got completely out of control. And when it got out of control, together with the person blowing, the fire flared up. And since the person wasn't required to anticipate, an unusual activity, such as a changing wind, is exempt from liability. But if this were to happen to one who is winnowing, he would be liable for violating the Sabbath, because even a normal wind suffices for winnowing. And that type of wind he intended to use. You get what I'm saying? So in other words, Abai is saying, look, with a normal wind, nothing would have been accomplished. So suddenly, some fire destruction did take off because the wind went out of control. But then that is an unanticipated event, and therefore the person isn't liable. But in the case of winnowing, Gavin, is that this task would be successful even with a normal wind compared to the case of the fire. So you're dealing with two different things here. In fact, the brisa can be understood now as follows. So in other words, if there was a sufficient force in his fanning together with a normal wind to produce a blaze, he's liable, even just like in the case of winnowing. But if his efforts wouldn't have succeeded even with the normal wind, he's not liable, since he's not expected to anticipate a stronger wind. Does that make sense? And then Rav Zera says the brisa refers to a case when he was just warming, breathing on the fire and not blowing it. So apologies, Gavin. I said Rav Zera. Beginning I said Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi agrees with you. Rav Zera doesn't. Rav Zera is basically saying that it's a guy it's winter. It's winter. So imagine a guy's going like this. He's blowing his hands warm to get it nice and toasty. Now that's not going to do anything. It's not going to do jack. And in that particular case, there's no liability because he's not contributing in any way to actually fanning a fire that's going to produce a blaze. He just breathed on it. Now, Rav Ashi is in good company with Gavin, because he says, when do we say that one who winnows and the wind assists him by blowing away the chaff, he's liable for his actions? Those words apply only with respect to the Shabbos, as Gavin says. The Torah prohibits purposeful behavior. So that's why I mentioned both answers, Gavin. But here in the case of damages, it's classified as a mere act of causation, and one who performs an act of causation is exempt with respect to damages. So in other words, in contrast to three previous opinions, because they were not arguing with the fact that winnowing on Shabbat is not a legitimate answer. They were saying it's actually a logical refutation of exactly as Kevin said, if you're liable creating a fire with the wind. In other words, if you're not liable creating a fire with the wind, why would you be liable on Shabbos for breaking Shabbos if you're winnowing when you partner with the wind? So it's saying what Kevin said, is it's a logical argument against it. So they all agree. The only one that doesn't agree is Rav Ashi, because he says, he rejects the notion. He says that the prohibition of winnowing on Shabbat demonstrates a general rule that if you harness external forces in the execution of a task, it's considered as though you've done the task yourself. So Rav Ashi basically says that this idea is unique to Shabbat, because the Torah forbids even a partially performed labor as long as it accomplishes the purpose. Okay, so as I said, if you write a sentence of gibberish, it's only rabbinically prohibited. It's not like it's got some constructive purpose. And how do we know this? Is in Shemot chapter 35, verse 33, it's got the word melechet machshevet. In other words, machshova is intention, and melechet is from the word melocha. It's one of the prohibited activities. But those prohibited activities have to mimic building of the Mishkan, meaning we're building something. So it has to be a purposeful activity. If it's not, there's no point. So in the case of winning, the person's partial contribution to the process suffices to render him liable, since his purpose of separating the chaff from the kernels is accomplished. That's the way Rashi defines it. There are other Rishonim apart from Rashi that maintain that even the laws of Shabbat don't hold one liable for an act he performed only partially. So they understand the Gemara as a case where winnowing is an exception, Damon, even on Shabbos, because it's formed together with the wind. In other words, the wind is a purposeful partner. It's not a partial activity. It's done in conjunction with the wind. So that's a difference. If you're looking in regard to damages, if you partially contribute to an act, viewed as having done it entirely by yourself, as far as so basically the only thing there is that if you fan the fire together with the wind, you're not responsible because it's grammar, it's indirect. Okay, meaning that there's another contributing factor that kind of removes you from the process. Just one thing to note is that winnowing is a problem, but we've got 4 minutes left, because you know what's going on, exactly as Gavin said. You're doing this process, you've done it before, and you're working with the wind. It's different in the case where you actually do something. Kevin, this is important. You have a fire. Kev, you falling asleep? If you have a fire, what you are allowed to do is put a fire retardant like water, even though you know that the fire is going to eventually catch on and be extinguished by the water. It's not putting out the fire directly, it's groma, it's indirect.
On Shabbos.
On Shabbos, because it's not like the act of winnowing where you're working together with the wind at the same time. Eventually the fire is going to come up to the point where it coincides time-wise with the fire retardant like water. Then it
gets extinguished.
Yes, but it's not.
But you're not throwing the water directly on the fire. It's like a barrier. It's like
correct. So that's why
I've heard that before. Yeah.
But when you're acting with the wind, in the case of winnowing on Shabbos, it's a problem because it's causative. You're working in partnership. Does that make sense? Yeah. So okay. So guys, listen. I think we've done enough for tonight.
So these days, in agriculture, there's a combine harvester does that winnowing process. It separates it. When you see it,
absolutely,
it goes. That's what it does. When you see it's going up into the air.
Do you really think even Albany is a bakery that sells to 50 million South Africans would sit there with people throwing stuff in the air? But we way past that with production. They've got these big turbines.
James?
That's what tractors do. They come up across, they've got these big turbines, and they've got separators.
Yeah. James?
Yeah.
About how a fire works, in case you want to know. What's the one thing a fire needs?
Fuel.
Oxygen. So if you're blowing into a fire from your mouth, you're blowing in carbon dioxide.
Carbon monoxide, yes.
It's not going to burn it. But when you got a wind going, okay, like if you're doing a braai, right, and you stop blowing it glows orange after a while because there's so much oxygen that you actually increase the temperature so much. But the minute you stop that flow, it calms down and just goes to regular flame and it cools down. So that's why when you say wind comes up, it's a much bigger open oxygen force coming in than you blowing in your hands. And it wouldn't work anyway. Even if you blew as hard as you wanted, you're blowing out carbon monoxide, which is one thing it doesn't need. It needs oxygen.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. That's
one reason why you're not responsible when you're blowing.
That's actually a very good point. I didn't think of this.
I think that's why you never got it right, Damon. Just switch off the recording. I just want to make a comment. It can't be on the air.
So he was there.